The vinyl of the booth was cracked like an old riverbed, sticking to the fine wool of his trousers. Minjun stared into the dregs of his black coffee, a swirling galaxy of bitterness that perfectly mirrored his mood. It was 7:47 p.m. The blind date, arranged by a well-meaning but foolish subordinate who thought his boss needed normalcy, was scheduled for 7:47 minutes, was a generous grace period in his world. In his world, 47 seconds could be the difference between a clean transaction and a body bag. He ran a thumb over the cold, heavy face of his watch. The second hand swept with a silent, unforgiving precision. He was a man who valued punctuality not as a courtesy, but as a pillar of control. This woman, this Avery, had failed the first, most fundamental test. He'd give it until the top of the hour, a final concession to the alien customs of civilian life, and then he would vanish back into the curated shadows where he belonged. The diner buzzed with a low, greasy warmth, the clatter of ceramic on formica, the sizzle from the grill, the murmur of conversations about mortgages and high school football. It was a language he could understand but never speak. He felt like a predator accidentally locked in a petting zoo, the air thick with a cloying innocence he could contaminate just by breathing it. His suit, a bespoke charcoal gray that cost more than the waitress's car, felt like armor and a cage all at once. He was about to signal for the check when a sound pierced the din. Not one sound, but 4 pairs of small, squeaking shoes approaching his table. He didn't look up, assuming they were just passing by. Then, a tiny voice, clear as a bell. "Excuse me, mister?" He lifted his gaze. Before him stood a small battalion. For little girls, identical down to the 2 neat braids that framed each of their faces, stood in a perfect, solemn line. They all wore bright crimson jackets over light pink dresses, their dark eyes wide and curious. They couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old. He blinked, the sight so incongruous it felt like a hallucination. His world did not contain small children in red coats. The girl at the front, evidently the spokesperson, took a small, courageous step forward. "Are you Mr. Kim?" she asked, pronouncing the name with careful precision.
The
use of his name, here, in this public space, sent a cold jolt through his veins. He scanned the diner. No one was watching. No new faces. Just the same tired patrons. He looked back at the child. He gave a single, curt nod. The girl beamed, a mission-accomplished smile that lit up her face. She turned to her sisters, who all nodded in unison. Then she turned back to him, puffed out her small chest, and made the announcement that tilted his world on its axis. "Our mommy's sorry she's late."
Miniones carefully constructed compose reflektiert.
He stared at the 4 girls, his mind racing through tactical assessments and threat analyses, finding none.
There was no protocol for this.
His life was a fortress of solitude, its walls built from discipline and emotional distance. These children, with their trusting eyes and identical red jackets, had just walked straight through the gate without a key. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? That their mother had 47 minutes to arrive and had failed? That he was a man whose business partners did not send their children as emissaries? Before he could formulate a response, the bell over the diner door jingled with a frantic energy. A woman rushed in, a gust of cold November air swirling around her. She wore a dark green coat over a simple beige dress, her face a canvas of harried apology. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the tableau at his table, for small girls interrogating a man who looked like he could snap a spine with one hand. Relief and mortification warred on her features. "Oh, thank goodness. Girls," she called, her voice a mix of stern command and exhausted affection. She hurried over, her bag slung over her shoulder. "Zara, Zuri, Zadie, Zoya. What did I tell you about running ahead?" The 4 girls turned, their solemnity melting away. "We found him, Mommy," one of them chirped. The woman, Avery, he presumed, finally looked at him. She had kind eyes, though they were shadowed with a fatigue that seemed bone-deep. "I am so sorry," she said, her breath coming in short pants. "The babysitter canceled last minute," Then Zoya couldn't find her left shoe. It was in the fruit bowl, of course, and the traffic was, well, it's my fault. I'm sorry, Minjun simply watched her, his silence a heavy, unreadable thing. He was accustomed to people being afraid of him, their apologies laced with terror. Hers was just sincere. He finally found his voice, the sound rougher than he intended. You are Avery, it wasn't a question. She nodded, trying to gather her small flock, who were now attempting to climb into the booth with him. And you're Minjun, she replied, offering a small, hesitant smile. It's nice to meet you. Even if I'm making a terrible first impression, one of the girls, Zadie, had successfully wedged herself beside him and was now staring at him with unnerving intensity. Your face is sad, she declared. Avery's eyes widened in horror. Zadie, that is not polite. But Minjun didn't flinch. He just looked at the little girl. Yes, he said, the single word holding more truth than he'd spoken all year. It is. The simple honesty of his reply hung in the air, disarming Avery completely. She had expected him to be annoyed, to dismiss them, to leave. She had not expected him to agree with her daughter's blunt assessment. The waitress, a young woman with a nervous habit of wiping her hands on her apron, approached the table, her eyes wide at the sudden population boom in booth 7. Can I get you folks anything else? She stammered, looking at Minjun for guidance. He held her gaze for a moment, a silent communication that made her stand up a little straighter. Then he looked at the 4 expectant faces peering at him over the table. 4 chocolate milkshakes, he said, his voice even. And another coffee for the lady. Avery started to protest. Oh, no, you don't have to. We should go. We've already imposed. Please, Minjun interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sit. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed, but there was no malice in it. It was a simple, solid instruction. Defeated by a day that had already wrung her dry, Avery slid into the booth opposite him, corralling her daughters onto the seat beside her. There was a flurry of scarlet jackets and tangled limbs before they settled. The milkshakes arrived in tall, frosted glasses, crowned with whipped cream and a cherry, and a moment of blissful silence descended as 4 small heads bent over 4 straws. Avery watched him over the rim of her new coffee cup. He hadn't smiled. His posture was still ramrod straight, his hands resting calmly on the table. Yet he had bought her children milkshakes. He had looked at Zadie without an ounce of anger and confirmed her observation. He was a puzzle of hard lines and unexpected softness. Thank you, she said quietly. You really didn't have to do that, he gave a slight inclination of his head. They were thirsty, the conversation, if it could be called that, proceeded in fits and starts, punctuated by the slurping of milkshakes and the occasional unfiltered question from the peanut gallery. Why do you wear a suit to a diner?
Zuri asked.
It is my work uniform, he answered. What's your work? Zara followed up. I am a consultant, he said, the lie smooth from years of practice. In logistics, Zoya, the quietest of the 4, suddenly piped up. Mommy's a painter. She paints magic pictures on the computer. Avery blushed slightly. I'm a graphic designer, sweetie, she looked at Minjun. I work from home, after they go to bed. It's chaotic. I can see that, he said, and for the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched, a fleeting ghost of a smile. Then it happened. A small elbow, a sudden, enthusiastic gesture from Zadie to show her mother a particularly impressive whipped cream mustache, and a tall, frosted glass of chocolate milkshake tipped over, cascading directly onto the lap of Minjun's $1,000 suit. A wave of thick, brown liquid soaked into the charcoal wool. The diner seemed to fall silent. Avery froze, a gasp caught in her throat. Oh my God.
I am so sorry.
Avery's apology was a frantic whisper. She fumbled in her purse for napkins, her hands trembling as she anticipated the explosion. She expected shouting, a cold, dismissive glare, a storm of fury. A man dressed like that, with an aura of such severe control, did not tolerate messes. Zadie's face crumpled, her lower lip trembling as she realized what she'd done. Tears welled in her big brown eyes. But Minjun did not move. He simply looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his trousers as if it were a curious meteorological event. He then slowly lifted his gaze, not to Avery, but to the terrified little girl beside him. He saw her fear, the silent panic of a child who has broken something expensive and is bracing for the consequences. He remembered that feeling well, a cold stone in the pit of his own childhood stomach. He reached over and took one of the napkins from Avery's hand. He didn't wipe at his suit. Instead, he gently dabbed the corner of Zadie's mouth, where a smudge of chocolate remained. "It is just a suit," he said, his voice impossibly calm. "It can be cleaned." He then looked at her trembling lip. "Tears will not help," Zadie sniffled, watching him with wide, watery eyes. The impending sob hitched in her throat, caught by his unexpected gentleness. Avery stared, utterly bewildered. She had seen grown men, dangerous men, flinch and recoil from his gaze in business meetings she designed presentations for. Yet here he was, comforting the child who had just ruined his clothes, his composure more absolute than ever. The tension at the table didn't break. It dissolved. The other three girls, who had been holding their breath, began to chatter again. The waitress, seeing no bloodshed, bustled over with a damp cloth. Avery, still flustered, began dabbing uselessly at the stain. "I'll pay for the dry cleaning. I'll pay for a new suit, whatever it costs." Minjun placed a hand over hers, stopping her frantic motions. His touch was firm, yet not rough. The contact sent a strange warmth through her. "It is not necessary," he said, withdrawing his hand as quickly as he'd offered it. The rest of the date was a surreal blur. He learned their favorite dinosaurs, all four inexplicably loved the Ankylosaurus, and that their bedtime was 8 o'clock sharp. He said almost nothing about himself, answering direct questions with a frustrating, elegant vagueness. But he watched. He watched the way Avery cut their food into tiny pieces, the way she knew which daughter hated the cherry and which one wanted extra whipped cream. He saw the easy, practiced rhythm of her motherhood, a dance of unconditional love and infinite patience. It was a kind of strength he had never witnessed up close. When the bill came, he paid in cash, leaving a tip that made the waitress's eyes widen. He walked them out into the crisp night air. The streetlights cast long shadows, and for a moment, his instincts flared. He scanned the street, the parked cars, the alleyways. A lifetime of caution. Avery was buckling her small army into their car seats, a process of clicks and pulls and arguments over who got to sit by which window. He stood by the driver's side door, a silent, imposing guardian. When she was finished, she turned to him, the car's interior light illuminating the weariness on her face. "Well," she said with a wry smile. This was probably the strangest blind date in history. "Probably," he agreed, the corner of his mouth twitching again. "I should go." Yes, but neither of them moved. There was an unspoken question hanging in the cold air between them. Then he did something that surprised them both. "I would like to see you again, Avery," he said, the words formal but the intent clear. "Without the milkshakes." Avery's breath caught in her throat. She had been so sure this disastrous evening was a one-off, a story she'd tell her friends about the time her kids crashed a blind date with a silent, intimidating man in a designer suit. His request was the last thing she expected. A small, hopeful flutter started in her chest, an emotion she hadn't felt in years. But it was immediately followed by a wave of practicality, of doubt. She gestured tiredly at the minivan, a vehicle perpetually littered with crushed crackers and stray crayons. "My life is this," she said, the word encompassing the chaos, the noise, the relentless demands of her four small shadows. "It's not exactly conducive to quiet dinners." Minjun looked from her to the car, then back to her face, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I am not looking for quiet," he said. The simple statement landed with more weight than a flowery promise. It acknowledged her reality, without judgment. He wasn't asking her to be someone she wasn't. He was asking to be let into the life she already had. A week later, he called. Not a text, but an actual phone call. His voice was the same as it had been in the diner, low, calm, and deliberate. He proposed a picnic in the park on Saturday. I have arranged for someone to assist you with the children, he explained. She is a professional. She has been thoroughly vetted. Avery was taken aback by the formality, but touched by the foresight. A vetted babysitter sounded intense, but the offer of an extra set of hands was a gift from the gods. When Saturday arrived, a kind, grandmotherly woman named Mrs. Gable appeared at her door precisely on time. The girls, usually shy with strangers, took to her immediately. At the park, Minjun was waiting. He wasn't in a suit. He wore dark jeans, a simple black sweater, and a leather jacket. The casual clothes did little to soften his imposing presence, but it made him seem more accessible. He had brought a large blanket and a basket filled not with fancy catering, but with things children would actually eat. Small sandwiches cut into star shapes, apple slices, juice boxes, and a container of strawberries. For them, he had brought a thermos of coffee and 2 thick slices of a decadent-looking chocolate cake. As the girls chased butterflies under Mrs. Gable's watchful eye, Avery and Minjun sat on the blanket and talked. This time, the conversation flowed more easily. He asked about her work, looking at the designs on her portfolio website with genuine interest. He asked about the girls, their distinct personalities, their funny habits. She, in turn, tried to probe past his defenses. So, logistics, she said, a playful challenge in her tone. Is it as boring as it sounds? A real smile, small but definite, touched his lips. At times. And what do you do when you're not consulting? He paused, looking out at the children playing near the ancient oak tree. His gaze grew distant. I read, he said finally. History. I find it predictable. It was a strange answer, but it felt honest. As they sat there, a comfortable silence grew between them. He wasn't trying to impress her with grand gestures or witty banter. He was just present. Later, Zoya tripped and scraped her knee. Before Avery could even stand up, Minjun was there. He knelt down, his movements fluid and efficient. He examined the small wound with a serious expression, then looked up at Zoya's tear-streaked face. It is a minor injury, he said, his tone factual, not dismissive. The pain will subside in approximately 5 minutes. Would you like a strawberry while we wait? The combination of clinical assessment and simple kindness was so uniquely him that Avery felt a genuine, unguarded laugh escape her. He looked up at the sound, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. It was in that moment, watching this severe, lonely man calmly negotiate a ceasefire with her crying 4-year-old, that she realized she was in very real danger of falling for him. Their world began to take on a new rhythm, a quiet cadence set by weekend park visits and the occasional, miraculous evening out. Minjun was a master of planning, anticipating obstacles with a strategist's precision. Babysitters were booked weeks in advance. Reservations were made at quiet restaurants with secluded booths. He seemed determined to carve out a space for them, a small pocket of calm in the whirlwind of Avery's life. He never intruded, never presumed. He would appear at her door with coffee on a Saturday morning and simply sit on her front steps with her, watching the girls ride their tricycles on the sidewalk. He learned their names, their faces, their tiny, distinct personalities. He knew Zara was the leader, Zuri the artist who drew on everything, Zaidi the emotional barometer of the group, and Zoya the silent observer who saw it all. He never raised his voice. When one of them had a tantrum, he would wait it out, a silent, unmovable presence, and then kneel down and speak to them in a low, even tone that cut through their tears more effectively than any shout. He was, Avery thought, the calmest person she had ever met. It was a stillness that she began to crave, a safe harbor in her own chaotic sea. One evening, after he'd helped her wrestle 4 overtired children into bed, they sat in her dimly lit living room, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. She was curled on the sofa, he was in the armchair opposite, a respectable distance between them. I don't understand you, Minjun, she said softly, twisting a loose thread on a cushion. He watched her, his expression patient. What is it you do not understand?
You, she said.
Your life is so orderly. Mine is a 5-alarm fire every single day. Why do you keep showing up? He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on his hands, which were clasped in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, laced with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "When my wife died," he began, and the words landed like stones in the quiet room. The world lost all its color. It was just gray. Muted. Avery's heart ached. She had wondered about his past, about the source of the profound sadness in his eyes. She remained silent, giving him the space to continue. "For 5 years, I have lived in that gray," he said, his voice strained. It was safe. It was controlled. There were no surprises. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. They were dark and filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that made her breath catch. "Your fire," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is the first color I have seen in a very long time." He stood then, as if the confession had cost him too much to remain seated. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Good night, Avery." He left without another word, leaving her in the quiet of her living room with his devastating honesty and the undeniable truth that her heart, which she had guarded so fiercely for so long, was no longer entirely her own. The confession changed everything. The careful distance he had always maintained began to shrink, replaced by a tentative, blossoming intimacy. A hand offered to help her out of the car would linger for a second longer than necessary. A shared look across a playground would hold a universe of unspoken understanding. He still hadn't kissed her, but the air between them crackled with the possibility. He was slowly, methodically, being woven into the fabric of her family. He fixed the perpetually wobbly leg of their kitchen table. He patiently assembled a ridiculously complex dollhouse that had been sitting in a box for months. He taught the girls a few simple words in Korean, which they would shout with glee. "Annyeong. Gamsahamnida." He became a fixture, a quiet, solid presence they all, Avery included, began to rely on. But with this deepening connection came a growing unease in Avery. His life remained a closed book. His logistics consulting involved late-night calls that would cause him to step outside, his voice dropping to a low, sharp tone. He was always aware of his surroundings, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. Once, while they were at the zoo, a man in a dark suit seemed to be watching them from a distance. Minjun noticed him immediately. He didn't tense up, but a subtle shift occurred in his posture. He moved, almost imperceptibly, to place himself between Avery and the stranger. A few minutes later, the man was gone. When she asked who it was, Minjun's answer was smooth and dismissive. A business associate. She knew he was lying. The incident planted a seed of fear. The sadness in his eyes, she had attributed solely to grief, now seemed more complex, tinged with a weariness that spoke of present dangers, not just past sorrows. The confrontation she had been avoiding became inevitable. It happened one rainy Tuesday night. He had brought over dinner, a rare quiet evening while the girls were at a sleepover at their grandmother's. They ate at the newly stable kitchen table, the sound of the rain drumming against the window panes. "I need you to tell me the truth, Minjun," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. He put down his chopsticks, his face a mask of stone. "The truth about what?" "About your work. About the man at the zoo. About why you look at every parked car like you expect it to explode." He was silent. The silence was his shield, his fortress. But she wouldn't back down.
"Not this time."
"I am falling in love with you," she said, the words raw and terrifyingly honest. "And my girls, they adore you. I can't let you into our lives, not all the way, if I'm living with a ghost. I need to know who you are." His eyes closed for a brief moment. It was the expression of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. When he opened them, the sadness was back, deeper than she had ever seen it. "My family," he began, his voice raspy, "is one of the oldest in Seoul. Our business is not logistics, Avery. It is enforcement. We solve problems for people who cannot go to the police. We have interests here and abroad. I am the head of my family. I am the one who inherited the throne." He didn't use the word mafia. He didn't have to. The truth, cold and brutal, settled in the space between them, more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. The rain beat against the glass, each drop a tiny hammer against the fragile bubble of the life she had built.
Mafia.
The word echoed in the sudden, vast silence of the kitchen. It was a word from movies, from headlines, not from her cozy, crayon-strewn world. Avery felt a chill seep into her bones that had nothing to do with the weather. She looked at the man across the table. The man who cut her daughter's sandwiches into star shapes, who spoke about grief with a poet's soul, who had the saddest eyes she had ever seen.
And he was a gangster.
A crime boss. The two realities were impossible to reconcile. Why? She whispered, the question encompassing everything. Why me? Why us? What were you thinking? Minjun did not look away. He owed her this, the unflinching truth. It was a mistake, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. My uncle arranged the date. He thought a normal woman would be a stabilizing influence. A political match. I went to end it before it began. I never expected, he trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the empty space that was usually filled with her daughters. I never expected you. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked street. When I saw them, your girls, for that first moment in the diner, I felt something I had not felt since my wife died.
Fear.
Not for myself.
For them.
Because I knew even then that my world is a poison, and I had no right to be near it. His confession was a blade, twisting in her heart. He hadn't pursued her out of recklessness, but in spite of his own better judgment. He had been drawn to their light, all the while knowing his own shadow could extinguish it. The men you see, he continued, his back still to her. They're my security, or they're my rivals. It is often hard to tell the difference. They watch me, which means they watch you. The seed of fear that had been planted at the zoo blossomed into full-blown terror. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Zara, Zuri, Zadie, and Zoya, her four bright, beautiful, vulnerable girls. She thought of their red jackets, a beacon in a crowd, a target. Her love for him was a real, tangible thing. But the primal, ferocious force of her love for her children was an inferno that would burn everything else to ash to keep them safe. You have to go, she said, her voice trembling but firm. He turned slowly, his face etched with a pain so profound it was almost physical. He had expected this. He had known this was the only possible outcome. I can't have this life touching theirs. I can't. Whatever this is between us, it has to end. Tonight, he walked towards the door, his steps heavy. He didn't try to argue or persuade her. He respected her decision because he knew it was the right one. The only one. With his hand on the doorknob, he paused and looked back at her, his eyes filled with a universe of regret. I will ensure you are protected, he said. You and the girls. You will never see me again, but you will never be unsafe. I swear it. Then he was gone. The closing of the door a final, deafening sound that left Avery alone in the storm. The days that followed were a study in gray, a return to the muted world Minjun had described as his own. Avery went through the motions of her life with a hollow ache in her chest. She made breakfast. She designed logos. She kissed scraped knees, but the color he had brought into her world had vanished with him. The girls felt his absence immediately. Where is Mr. Min? Zoya asked one evening, her small voice cutting through the dinner-time chatter. Is he mad about the milkshake? No, sweetie, he's not mad, Avery said, her voice brighter than she felt. He's just busy. With his work, they accepted the explanation, but they kept asking. They would look for his car on the street, would mention him in their bedtime prayers. He had become a part of their orbit, and his sudden disappearance left a tangible void. Avery found herself looking over her shoulder, scanning parked cars, just as he had. But she saw no one. No dark suits, no watchful eyes. He was keeping his promise. He was a ghost, protecting them from a distance, and the knowledge was both a comfort and a fresh wave of grief. She knew she had made the right choice. The only choice. But the right choice felt like a punishment. A month after he left, a sleek black car pulled up to her curb. Avery's heart leaped into her throat. A man in a crisp suit got out. It wasn't Minjun. It was an older Korean man with gray temples and a kind, but serious, expression. He introduced himself as Mr. Choi, Minjun's uncle. the one who had arranged the date. He asked if he could have a word. Hesitantly, she agreed, meeting him on her front porch. "My nephew is a good man, born into a bad life," Mr. Choi said, his English perfect and formal. "He is loyal. He is honorable. But he has been a king in a cage for a very long time. He has forgotten what it is to live." He explained that Min-jun was making arrangements to step back, to cede control of the day-to-day operations to him, to move the family's business into more legitimate enterprises, a slow, dangerous process. "He is doing this," Mr. Choi said, his gaze direct, "because he believes a man with a shadow as long as his has no right to stand in the sun. He is trying to make himself smaller. To erase the part of him he thinks you cannot love." Mr. Choi reached into his coat and pulled out a simple, sealed envelope. "He asked me to give you this. He is leaving for Seoul tonight. He said not to give it to you until after his plane was in the air." He placed the envelope in her hand. "My nephew does not know I am telling you this. He would be angry, but I am an old man. I have seen enough regret for one lifetime. A man can change his business, but he cannot change his heart." He bowed slightly and left. Avery stood on the porch, the envelope feeling heavy in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had told him to go, and he had. But he was also trying to change, to dismantle the very cage that had separated them. She had a choice. She could let him go, accept the safety he was offering her. Or she could fight for the man who saw color in her fire, the man who was now trying to step out of the gray for her. She tore open the envelope. Inside was not a letter, but a single plane ticket to Seoul. One way. And beneath it, a small, folded piece of paper. On it, in his precise handwriting, were just 3 words. In case he hadn't finished the sentence. He was leaving the choice, the ending, entirely up to her. A full year later, the air in Seoul was thick with the scent of street food and the promise of spring. In a small, sun-drenched apartment overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street, the sound of laughter echoed. It was a chaotic, joyful noise, the sound of 4 small girls on a mission. Their mission, at present, was to decorate Min-jun with as many sparkly butterfly stickers as they could. He sat on the floor, ramrod straight as always, but his bespoke suit had been replaced by a soft gray sweater. A large, shimmering purple butterfly was stuck firmly to his forehead. He endured the attack with the stoic patience of a man who had faced down Yakuza assassins and now considered this his most perilous assignment. Avery watched from the doorway of the small kitchen, a warm mug of tea in her hands, a slow, happy smile on her face. The decision to get on that plane had been the most terrifying and bravest thing she had ever done. The first few months had been an adjustment, a navigation of new languages, new customs, and the ever-present, but now distant shadow of his former life. Mr. Choi had been true to his word. Min-jun had transitioned into the role of a legitimate chairman, his days filled with boardrooms and investment portfolios, not back-alley negotiations. The danger had receded, becoming a story from a previous chapter rather than a daily threat. He was still the same man, quiet, observant, with a sadness that would likely never fully leave his eyes. But it was different now. It was a memory, not a cage. The gray had given way to color. He smiled more now, small, genuine smiles that were reserved just for her and the girls. He laughed, too, a low, rumbling sound that he seemed surprised by every time it escaped. He was learning to live, and they were his teachers. Zadie, the official sticker applicator-in-chief, patted his cheek. "All done," she announced proudly. "You are very beautiful now, Mr. Min." "He's not Mr. Min anymore," Zuri corrected her sister. "Not for the first time. He's Appa." Min-jun looked up at Avery, his eyes meeting hers over the heads of their daughters. In his gaze, she saw it all. The gratitude, the disbelief, the quiet, overwhelming love. The journey had been fraught with uncertainty, but here, in this peaceful apartment halfway around the world, they had built their own small kingdom, one founded not on power or fear, but on patience, resilience, and the transformative magic of 4 little girls in red jackets. Later that evening, after the sticker-adorned Appa had successfully wrangled the girls into bed, he and Avery stood on the small balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life. The air was cool, and he wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair, the words he had said so many times but still felt so deeply. "For what?" she murmured, leaning into his warmth. For finishing the sentence, she smiled, remembering the note. In case she had finished it for him. In case you want to build a life. In case you believe me. In case you love me, too. He had left the door open a crack, and she had kicked it wide open, letting all the light and chaos of her world pour into his, chasing the shadows away for good. The quiet man and the fiery woman, the consultant and the artist, had found their own version of logistics, a complex, beautiful, and perfectly imperfect system for moving four small, precious hearts safely through the world, together.